I'm very glad to introduce Adrian, to first welcome and then introduce Adrian Heathfield to you. Adrian has also been a guest of Cultures of the Curatorial in the context of a previous research project, which had a lot to do with timing and the Curatorial. Let me know what I can do. The way that he introduced himself is he's working across the scenes of life, art, performance, and dance. And from the curatorial point of view, one might want to add that he's also working across the scenes of public appearance, of duration, and of afterlife. Among his numerous publications, particularly for us relevant, were Perform, Repeat, Record, Life Art in History, which he edited together with Emilia Jones, and more recently, Life Art and Performance. He directed the European Union-funded creative research project Curating the Ephemeral, which took him between 2014 to 2016, and was very much kind of oriented towards immaterial art and museum practices. He curated a number of significant performance projects in museums, theaters, and galleries, including live culture at the Tate Modern in 2003 and in the Taiwan Pavilion for the 57th Venice Biennial in 2017. And he's one of the directors, as Nora has already introduced us to, of the collective Free Thought, founded in 2011 and working, I quote, in public research and in curating concepts of urgency. And in this capacity, the Free Thoughts, were the curators of the one before last biennial Bergen Assembly. Life art he describes along the lines of terms that I think are most pertinent also for today's discussion on the curatorial. I quote, its unrivaled capacity to generate new forms of relation, collaboration, and community that negotiate and traverse one's solid divisions, unquote. In his own curatorial work and writing, Heathfield is careful, as he writes, to keep a vigilance, and I like that term very much, towards the dynamics of institutional and market assimilation, which I think you termed particularly in relation to life arts being entering into the museum and being absorbed by museums. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Beatrice, Benjamin, Agnieszka, Julia, and also Timon and Stefan for sorting the tech. Happy birthday. Happy many birthdays. So what I want to talk about today is one project that emerged out of multiple projects from this sort of long research trajectory that was called Curating the Ephemeral and was dealing with the status of immaterial art practices in museums. And the projects were taking place internationally in different locales. The project I'll talk about today was originally situated in San Francisco, but then realized in a museum in Philadelphia. And in this project, I was working in a kind of liminal non-identity, as I often do, somewhat as a dramaturg, somewhat as a writer, and somewhat as a curator. So moving, as it were, between these different kinds of zones of practice. But the project that I'm going to talk about today also manifests certain investments that are quite long-standing for me in relationship to questions of the temporality of performance, which the temporality of performance has had quite a specific and limited determination, particularly in the field of performance studies, where it's often largely been thought through the framework of eventhood. where momentariness and the instant are paradigmatic, and the event is often isolate, bracketed, thought as breach or fissure or interruption in various orders and institutions of knowledge and power. Less time, much less time, certainly in performance studies, has been given to the prolonged, the processual, the continuous, the resilient and obdurate, the lingering and insistent dynamics of performance, and in particular to what I would think of as performance's slow morphologies, which you'll hear more about in a few moments, and is very much connected to the trying again of which we are considering today. So what I'm going to say is really chasing. It's in pursuit of performance's persistent mattering, its historical movements of formation and transformation, what I would call the animmateriality of its afterlives. I'm going to think about this in relationship to a feminist genealogy of performance making, and in particular what I would term within that genealogy, it's a genealogy of spirited affinity. And in this case, the spirited affinity is enacted through a trans-generational and cross-art form dialogue. Affinity here is not just influence. It's not a simple identification between present subjects. I'm talking about artists and artists' work. When thought historically and materially, it's a kind of folding of absent figures and immaterial forces into itself. So none of the persons and articulations in this genealogy that I'll speak of is an originary or unitary influence. Rather, they are carriers of investments, intensities, and expressions. And spirited affinities, of which I'll talk, are things which cross historical epochs, distinct cultures and belief systems, and they come in and out of critical currency and visibility, showing at different times. Nonetheless, they act as sustaining forces in the fostering of new lives and work. What I'm calling spirited affinity is not necessarily passing through institutional validation, systems of knowledge, or even conscious recognition on the part of participants, though it may have contact with those powers. And above all, it's not a correspondence or a connectedness of likeness, but it's a kind of empathy across and within different and differentiating situations that generates a habitat of making. Now, in that regard, a genealogy of spirited affinity might be thought as a kind of transhistorical version of what Isabel Stengers calls ecologies of practices. Right? These are shared habitats of thinking, doing, feeling, manifestations of belonging and communion in divergence that respect the singularity of their inhabitants' practices. Interconnectedness in this context, while attendant to social obligation, is not oriented toward or founded on identities, but it's forged through what participants or things may become. And in this regard, Stengers describes a different kind of ecological relation between subjects and knowledge-making. As in ritual, she says, it is no longer I, as a subject, as meant to belong to nobody but myself, who thinks and feels. Consequently, such ecologies are hosts of critical social self-transformation. Stengers says a decision without a decision maker is making the maker. And this is a very sort of precise description, I think, of what is happening in this collaborative relation that I was engaged with for over the period of a couple of years. So I'm going to talk in sort of quite a bit of detail about the work itself. In 2012, visual artist Janine Antoni began a collaboration with preeminent movement, theatre and community artist Anna Halprin. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the artist's work, Antoni is largely known as a sculptor whose practice often utilizes durational labor to make singular traces of her body in materials and spaces, marking and questioning sexual difference. And her work's use of repetitive actions with everyday materials have led to its interpretation as a contemporary descendant of feminist process-oriented art of the 1960s and 70s. This is a work called Behold, in which Antoni's ear is placed into the marble which is cast from the interior of her hand. This is Lick and Lather. These are effectively self-portraits, multiple self-portraits. One is made of chocolate, the other is made of soap. The ones made of chocolate are licked into different defacements, and the ones made of soap are bathed with over long durations until they are defaced, and they, in a sense, sit across from each other in displayed space. This is Noor, perhaps one of the sort of most famous early works of hers. The materials are lard and chocolate, solid lard, solid chocolate, and I'm sure you can guess what's happened to these minimalist cubes, which is that they have been progressively gnawed by the artist until they take more softer or organic forms. This is More, which is a participatory work in which for many, many hours she takes materials from visitors and weaves them into a long rope which eventually spews out of the gallery space. And Loving Care, a performance in which Loving Care is the name of a particular hair dye which keeps the hair black. And in this piece she paints the floor of the gallery backwards so that the floor is blacked out until the spectators are excluded from the gallery space. So Antoni's historical difference from this lineage of feminist process-oriented art of the 60s and 70s is often seen as her highly personal exploration of the psychological paradoxes of patriarchal powers for the desiring female subject, and also her very intimate explorations of filiation. This piece is a photographic work called Mum, and you see Antoni is with her mum. This is If I Die Before I Wake, which sort of fuses casts of her and her mother's hands. Halprin, whose image you saw previously, thank you, Nora, in another version of this collaboration. Halprin, who's now 99, is seen by many as one of the most important and perhaps under-acknowledged sources of postmodern dance. Since the late 30s, she's made over 150 full-length dance theatre works. Initially, she was known for radical breaches of the proscenium division, the use of improvisation in transdisciplinary works, and the melding of actional or task-based sequences with choreographic and dramatic materials. So working for much of her career on an elevated outdoor dance deck in a redwood forest, which was built by her life partner, environmental architect Lawrence Halprin, her work pioneered the abandonment of performance enclosures for movement interventions in the street and in specific natural sites. And with Lawrence Halprin, she developed radical redeterminations of the practice of scoring within choreographic creation. And her early work in community-oriented processes was often concerned with racism and the politics of sexuality and health, but in later years has turned towards pedagogic initiatives, new large-scale public rituals, and practices of conciliation, attunement, and acceptance in relation to social division, ecology, and mortality. So Anthony began working with Halprin on a very specific scene from one of her most memorable and influential theatre works called Parades and Changes, and that was first staged in Stockholm in 1965. And in a move almost unimaginable from a contemporary perspective, but fortunate for art historians, the piece was actually filmed and televised there nationally. And the specific scene they worked from involved a mixed group of performers slowly peeling off their kind of uniform or office clothes, and then laying out large sheets of brown paper, then quietly caressing, tearing, lifting, wrapping themselves into a skinny, rustling, mobile, cloud-like assemblage. I'll play you just a little clip because I know that we're pressed for time, so you'll get a sense of the work. hope you get a sense of it from that. It becomes this kind of amorphous flesh paper assemblage that kind of travels across the space. That was 1964, so 2 years later, in its New York City premiere, the police department were much less welcoming than the Swedish television company, and they immediately issued a warrant for Halprin's arrest on grounds of indecent exposure. Using the unusually intimate relationship with matter found in Antony's sculptural sensibility, Halprin and Antony reinvented a fragment from this work as a sustained improvised movement process with paper. The interactions between flesh and processed material in the work, subsequently titled Paper Dance, draw from Antony's history of using her whole body, remember the teeth, not just her hands, as tools made to make artworks. In this extract of a film from November 2015, so now we're 50 years later from the original film, which is a film made by the British photographer Hugo Glendinning, we see Antony performing a version of this new work, and this is a piece that's performed on Halprin's outdoor dance deck in Kentfield in California. So again, I'll just give you a kind of brief sort of 4-minute clip of this so that you can understand what's happening in terms of morphology in relationship to this work. Okay, so though Antony had been aware of Halprin's oeuvre for over 20 years, their first physical encounter was in Antony's late 40s, when Halprin was already in her 90s. And it's this transgenerational dimension of their collaboration that interests me in terms of thinking what the meaning of a spirited affinity might be, and also its social and cultural consequence. Antony's immediate response to their long lack of contact and to her subsequent envelopment in Halprin's practice and ethos was to initiate a new phase of her own work. And when I asked her what motivated this new work, she replied, one question: how can we meet each other in the past? At that time, Antony was frequently being asked, as established mid-career artists are, to mount a retrospective of her body of sculptural and photographic works. But Antony was wary of this exhibition genre, whose function is to trace an individual artist's trajectory from the past into the present, thereby accumulating weighted understandings and new perspectives from the act of overviewing their oeuvre. She distrusted its self-consolidating, internally cohering, narrative and teleological tendencies. She decided that the only means to retrospect would be to regenerate or transform her existing works, to pass her works through the bodies or visions of others. In this way, the identitarian, historiographic, and scopic traditions of retrospection would be put in question. And so Antony's work with Halprin became a means to re-question and to relationally remake her own oeuvre. So in its recent gallery manifestation, Paper Dance is performed many times over the long duration of an exhibition. It's a 3-month exhibition, and it's performed weekly 1 or 2 times. So it's taking place in a slowly shifting environment composed of an arena of many cratered sculptural and photographic works by Antony. A projected filmic fragment of the originary scene from Parades and Changes is also there, and the accumulating remnants of paper that are left over from every performance. Right? Each performance begins with Antony unpacking and displaying 1 or 2 or 3 of the cratered works, and continues as an extended improvisation with, for, and beside an assemblage of the presented and hidden works. In the periods between performances, the chosen works remain on display until they're packed up again, and the beginning of the next performance, and a new work is revealed. Sometimes not just 1 work, 2, 3. By showing, but largely withdrawing her works from view, Antony makes a powerful address to the exhibition format of the retrospective. Her previous works form an assembly around her, a council of present but invisible things, accompanying and reverberating with her many acts of creation. So this is a slow time retrospective then, but one in which the subject's work is barely visible, intermittent, inflected differently on a weekly basis by repeated performances. For Antony, the self-seeing and self-evaluation implied in these acts is triggered by and accessed through the work of another, Halprin, whose history touches but far exceeds her own. In Parades and Changes, Halprin brought the outside, the obscene in theatrical terms, into the theatre through a communal encounter with paper and flesh. Antony draws from Halprin's architecturally embedded reattunements of movement practice to elemental conditions, the openness to the flows of air, cloud, the woods, to the sounds of machines, plant and animal life. She then regenerates her own material sculptural engagements through these environmental openings, returning her exteriorizations, in a sense, to the inside of the gallery space. You'll see also in this work that these recurrent images of birth and also the force of the elemental. There's another force of the elemental. So in comparison to her previous works, these temporary sculptures in paper seem insubstantial, but they carry what we could call, after David Abram, the remembering of air. They hold, move, and rustle with that element so sensually encountered on Halprin's elevated deck, that element, invisible yet palpable, in which human life and plant life are symbiotically immersed, the unseen common medium through which we coexist and breathe, the source of inspiration. In this transplantation of a performance into the gallery, the new environment is the residual material of Antony and Halprin's creative histories, encountered within the contiguity of an assembly. Serial improvised performances act as the entwining of the two histories in the present, subjecting their materials to a persistent morphology. However, this is not a smooth matrilineal continuum, but a kind of continuous cleaving, a gathering and a parting, a continuation without continuity. It's very similar to what was being spoken of earlier as a means through which one can research and perceive differentiation happening in the moment between the artist's visions. So Halprin's original work, both naked flesh and in Halprin's work, both naked flesh and paper are given a natural affinity as they emerge in a reverential condition from a cacophony of mediated human noise. But for Antony, the paper is radically malleable, a synthetic processed material used to create a series of body molds, second skins, momentary images and symbolizations destined for discard or recycling. This material has an uncanny life itself. It breathes and it moves, and Antony constantly reattunes her performance to that thingliness, denaturing her nature, calling into question the disjunction between the source and the trace, flesh and paper, body part, and its mimetic rendition. So the relation here between paper and flesh is really appears to be a kind of auto-poetic relation. One thing just leads to another, and it's impossible to decide where the agency of image generation resides. And that impossibility is really from that deep genealogical relation to Halprin's work is really to do with this cusp of the relation between the human and the non-human that we were speaking of earlier. So what I'm trying to do is to try to conjure for you what also might be at stake in regimes or systems of showing, regimes or systems of visibility as they relate to a feminine artist, a feminist artist, and feminist artists in kind of deep collaborative relations, where the trying again of this gathering is really about instances of transformative iteration over time. And I see that really as one of the main windows for thinking about the afterlives of performance, not just their eventhood, but their persistent mattering. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, first of all, for this wonderful condensed paper. And the question would be, how would you describe the relation that you have seen exemplified by Antony's work with relation to meeting again in history, bringing two history together in the present, in relation to a kind of straightforward curatorial situation? Is that a similar situation? Or in relation to reenactments of exhibitions, for example? Yeah.
So it's not, most decidedly not a reenactment. And of course, in very obvious senses, it is a reenactment of something. Of course, the integrity of the work itself, which is always the question of reenactment, phrased, as it were, archivally in relationship to an origin, right? Here, the originary work is already broken, right? It's a theatre work that is already an open theatre work, and what Halperin gives to Antony is simply a fragment of that work in the first place. So we're already in a different framework, I think, of most of the frameworks of that certain kind of trajectory of reenactment work in museums that took place, from the late 90s, I'd say, into the noughties, late noughties. The morphology that takes place here collaboratively as well, I think, marks it out, and it becomes another work, right? So it's one that's communally owned by Halperin and Antony in particular ways. In terms of curatorial practice in the museum space, it became very problematic, and therein, I think, tells you something about the criticality of its position in relationship to economies of visibility within the museum, because it was really hell to negotiate with the museum staff the idea that Antony would bring 30 years of work to the museum, and it would all be in crates, and that it would be exhibited crated, and that largely it would at most times be unseen, right? And so this idea was very difficult for them to navigate in the first place, but it also tripped up a whole set of logistics parameters within the museum. For instance, the regime of thinking around insurance, because crates are insured for transport, they're not insured to become seats. And the museum, for instance, were completely freaking out about the idea that large numbers of people would be sitting on artworks for a lot of time. But also what it meant in terms of the animation of the processes of exhibition in the space, which were almost constantly in transformation. So the show itself was never a static thing, but also its engagement with staff was then also durational and continuous, right? So because they were also engaged in maintaining and sustaining the care of its transformation over time. So this was a very different figuration of the relationship between curators, museum staff, and material things. Yeah.
Thank you.